I'm David Smith and I am a technical expert with Olympus cameras, but of course I am also a photographer. Now, most of my photography is macro photography, but a little bit I like to do some bird photography as well. Now, we're here at Paxton Pitts Nature Reserve to photograph some birds. So when you come out to somewhere like this where there is birds and wildlife to take pictures of, you really need to make sure that you've got some equipment that can help you do that. And there are loads of different reasons why you might pick a certain bit of equipment. Now, the main reasons why I picked to take an EM1X out with me today is one, because it's super light. So there's a fairly healthy walk all the way around here, and I don't want to be weighed down too much with loads of kit. So lightweight stuff is really, really important. So when you want to start thinking about taking pictures of birds, you need to think that they're probably going to be moving. They could be moving quite fast, so speed is important. It's not just shutter speed, but it's how fast you can take a sequence of images in a burst. Now, I really, really love the OMD series for that, because the EM1s, the EM1X and the EM1 Mark III as well, they can shoot up to 60 frames per second. So it's a really, really quick shooting burst. The better burst to use would be an 18 frames per second burst, which the camera can also do, and that's because we can use those 18 frames per second with continual autofocus. So if a bird or an animal is moving around, I can lock onto it, the camera continually focuses as the subject moves, and then I can release a burst at 18 frames per second, so capturing all the action pretty much. Now, of course, it's all great having loads of cool features in your camera, but it's no good if you haven't got a well-supported lens on the front of it. So the lens that I've got attached at the moment is an f4 lens. It's 300mm focal length, it's fixed, and it's f4, which in terms of the length of it is nice and bright. Now, the aperture is what lets light into the lens, okay? And it's also what helps us to maintain a nice fast shutter speed by getting lots of light in there. So realistically, you want to be looking for lenses that either have a constant aperture, like a constant f2.8 if they're a telephoto lens, or a nice bright f4 like on this 300mm, and keeping that nice and wide so that we've got loads of light coming into the lens, keeping the shutter speed up and keeping the ISO nice and low. If you're going to take a photograph of an animal, then the first thing to think about is it moving? Is it going to move? And then if it's not moving, which one of the factors of your photography settings can you change in order to compromise everything else? You've obviously got three different factors to take into consideration to change your exposure. That's your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. It really is up to you whether or not you start creeping into higher ISOs. It's personal preference for me that I don't mind going up to sort of ISO 6400, knowing that I'll still get a pretty reasonable shot, but I can also work on any noise that might come into the image in post-process as well. Now, not everybody likes to work on post-process and noise, so most people will try and keep that ISO as low as possible and try and bounce back between the shutter and the aperture in terms of light and speed. But of course, it is all circumstantial. It's going to depend on what light and what situation you've got in the environment wherever you are. Today, we're really lucky because we've got such bright sunlight that's actually probably going to make it really easy to take pictures of the birds around the water. And also, just to make it a little bit easier, I'll be using a center-weighted metering mode so that my camera is focusing all of its options around the sort of central part of my frame in terms of keeping that exposure in the right place. So of course, having a nice wide aperture is great for getting the light in, but if you've got a nice sunny day like this and you've got loads of light coming in anyway, you might want to stop that aperture down to a smaller aperture for things like depth of field. If you shoot wide open on an f2.8 lens, then you may very well only get the eyes or the beak of a bird in focus and everything else starts to fall out of focus. So in order to get that depth of field, we might stop down from f2.8 to f4 or f5.6 if you've got the light. But obviously, if you don't have the light, you really do want to be shooting wide open to pull as much of that light into the camera, keep that shutter speed nice and high. Now, luckily, my EM1X works really, really well in terms of pushing higher ISO. So if I need to push a higher ISO to get my shutter speed up, then I can do. But on the other side of that, if perhaps I want to keep a nice clean ISO and I've got a bird that's maybe sitting still or not moving very fast, then the camera has exceptional stabilization, so I can reduce my shutter speed. That's going to let more light into the camera, but the stabilization is going to keep it nice and solid for me. So I can still get nice crisp shots on those subjects that are not shooting around everywhere. So when you're planning to come out, obviously you need to think about what's going to be going on in terms of the weather. Now, today is going to be a little bit strange because there are some species of birds that are really active when the sun's bright and they go hunting for food and things like that. And there are some species of birds that don't do a great deal because there's a lot of hard light around, so they don't want to kind of get caught up in that hard light. It'll vary from place to place where you go and the different species that you're looking for. And of course, it's just really one of those things that you kind of check ahead where you're going. Is the weather going to affect it? And are you going to get some great shots? Now today, I think we'll get a mix of shots, but a lot of the birds are very subdued because it is super, super bright. And every now and again, we seem to be getting some really, really high winds. And obviously the birds won't be flying about in those high winds. So we've come over to the Kingfisher Hide here at Paxton Pitts Nature Reserve, and it's a really nice central location. We can kind of look out straight forward, left and right, look at all the wildlife. And I thought it'd be a good time to take a look at what we brought in the bag today. So first and foremost, the most important thing is my camera. So I've got an EM1X with me today. The EM1X is a superb wildlife camera, loads of different reasons why I use it. One of the main reasons is that it's got some technology in there that makes it great for shooting birds in particular. But also there's a balance aspect to this because I'm going to be using some larger lenses. Then this body really kind of helps me work on that balance. It's got plenty of power as well, so it's good if I'm out all day, then I don't need to worry about running out of power because I've got 2 batteries in there. And also it's weather sealed. So if the weather does change, even though it's really beautiful now, obviously it could change in an instant and I don't really need to worry about getting this kit wet. So let's pop that down there. Now, it's really important as well when you go out shooting wildlife that you think about the lenses that you're going to take first and realistically which lenses are going to be best for which location. So because the kit that I use is a lot lighter, I've been able to bring 3 lenses with me today. I've got a reasonable medium telephoto lens. So this is a 40-150, and again this is a weather sealed lens as well, so I don't need to worry if I get rained on or anything like that. It's a pro lens, which means that it's really fast. So if the light dips, then I've got a constant f2.8 aperture that I can work with on this lens. So that's really, really handy to have when you're out, particularly in British weather, obviously, because the light could disappear at any point. So that's one of my favourite lenses as well. It's very multifunctional, not just for wildlife, for lots of different things as well. So the other lens that I like to play around with when we're out here is the 300mm. This is a prime, so there's no zoom to this one. It's a fixed 300mm prime. It's f4 again, so it's still really nice and bright at that. It's a little bit larger, but for what it could be in size-wise, it's still a smaller lens because it's a micro four thirds, and it keeps it nice and light as well. And there's a really good balance between this lens and the EM1X body that I use as well. And balance is really, really key, particularly when you're going to be carrying it around all day. So this is a superb lens to use as well. And then the third lens that I brought, the last one, is a little bit rarer. This is a Pro 150-400mm lens. Now, I love this lens because, again, it's got a constant aperture. This is an f4.5 lens. So no matter where I am in that zoom range, I get f4.5. Plus, I can utilize things like a built-in teleconverter and get a little bit more length out of it as well. It's a superb lens, but for its size, because of what it's built out of, it's super light. And lightness is the key. If you're going to be walking around all day, then you want to keep the system really light and not carry things around that are going to hurt your back and things like that. So this is one of my favorites at the moment, but it is an exceptionally rare lens. So we're going to look after this one greatly. And then all 3 of these lenses have an extra kind of capability, and that's really good because I've got a 2x teleconverter, and this is an optical teleconverter that I can put in between the lens and the camera, and that's going to extend all of my focal lengths by 2 times. So it's going to make my 40-150 into an 80-300. That's micro four thirds focal length. So if you're thinking about what a 35mm system would be, then that then turns into a 160-600mm. So it's a really nice flexible range. Then the 300mm f4 becomes a 600 or a 1200 in 35mm terms. And then my 150-400, if I put the 2x converter on and use its built-in converter as well, is going to get me all the way up to 2000mm in 35mm terms. So really, really handy little piece of kit to have on there as well. All of this is not too heavy, so it fits nicely in the backpack. I don't have to worry about it too much. All of it is weatherproof, and as you can hear, the wind is up, which means that the clouds could come in at any moment and rain on our parade. So it's really, really important to have some equipment that you feel really confident about if that's going to happen. So now that I've got my 40-150 on, that's the shorter of the telephoto lenses that I'm going to be using today. And the reason for that is that there are some swans and some birds that are quite close to me. So I want a bit of flexibility on using that kind of near telephoto end. I've got it on the EM1X, so we're just going to pop it on. It's quite windy at the moment, so the birds are kind of dotted around and they're sort of being pushed around the water as well. So you've got to kind of keep an eye on them. The light is super, super bright just on the water as well. And obviously swans are white, so we need to think about what we're going to do with that. There are some young swans though, so they're a little bit easy to shoot because they're grey. First thing I'm going to do, let's turn around my monitor, have a look at some of the settings that I've got on here. And don't forget to remove the lens cap, of course. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to check that I've got my camera in auto ISO. I'm using the auto ISO because it allows me the flexibility to change my shutter speed and the aperture to how I want it. And I want a reasonably fast shutter speed, but these birds are just floating around at the moment. So I'm just going to set this at around 500th of a second. Now, this lens can go to f2.8, but I'm going to probably shoot this at f4 just to get some depth of field. So I'm going to just turn that in, dial up f4 onto my camera. 500th of a second at f4 in auto ISO. Nothing crazy at the moment because these birds are just floating around. So let's see if we can get some decent shots of them. Okay, so I'm going to change lenses now. The 40-150 was really good for doing some of the swans that were just floating about quite close. They're now moving away, the wind's kind of pushing them in one direction, so I'm going to switch up and go to my 300mm f4. So really important when you're changing lenses, particularly on mirrorless cameras, you make sure you switch your camera off because you don't want them switched on and then opening up that sensor to anything that's going on outside. I'm going to keep my camera pointed downwards so that it prevents anything from kind of sneaking in there. And then what I want to do is just pop on my 300mm very quickly. So I'm going to tweak all of the settings now to what I'm going to use for the rest of the day. And that's things like continual autofocus, my AF grids, the file formats that I'm saving in, so things like JPEG and RAW, etc. Now on the back of my camera there's a super control panel. It's like a quick menu and it's nice and easy to handle. So I can just enter that and change things like my ISO and my white balance nice and easily. But the things that I want to change for today are my autofocusing options. So I'm just going to choose continual autofocus for the moment. I'm also going to switch off my face priority because it's an unnecessary feature when we're shooting these birds. And then I'm going to put my shooting mode, my drive mode, into a burst, and I'm going to use a low-speed silent burst. Okay, so that's an electronic shutter feature, and it's quiet. In fact, it's absolutely silent. So that's really, really good when you're shooting a burst. You don't want your camera to sound like a machine gun going off, which would scare the wildlife. So all I'm going to do is pop that into a low-speed silent burst, so no noise comes out of my camera. And then the last thing to check is that you're going to be shooting in the right format. So for me, I've got 2 memory card slots, and I'm going to tell my camera that I want to save in one slot. I'm going to be saving JPEG, and then in the other slot, I'm going to be saving RAW. So the reason why I split my file formats in terms of RAW on one card and JPEG on the other is one, so that I've got a copy of each one, but I'll use the JPEGs if I want to connect my phone to my camera via the app. And I'll transfer those JPEGs over, and I might share them instantly on social media or something like that. And then of course the RAW file is for when I want to go home and do some post-process editing. But separating them just makes it a little bit safer in case something happens to one card or the other. Now the hides at reserves like this are really, really good for being able to take pictures of the birds. It's great to get out of the weather as well, but at some point there'll be some limitations. Like right now, the birds have started to all drift into different parts of the water and I can't really get a good shot of them. So it's a perfect time to zip the bag up and go for a walk and see if we can get some better angles. Okay, so I'm going to change my lens. I've been working with the 300mm, which is great. It's a fantastic lens, but it's at a fixed point, so I don't have any zoom, I don't have any flexibility. As I'm walking around today, the birds are making it a little bit harder because they're sometimes close and sometimes far away. So I'm going to change over and I'm going to go ahead and put on this 150 to 400. I'm putting this on because it is super flexible between 150 to 400, but again, it's one of those constant aperture lenses. So this is f4.5, which means that I can stay at f4.5 right the way through the zoom. And if the light's changing, or if like in here, we've got really dappled light or shadows, then that's super useful. Now, as I said, the EM1X is the best thing to take out here because it has got that bird eye detection system. And of course, you can detect different subjects, so you do need to tell the camera what you want to detect. First things first though, you need to be shooting in the right focusing mode. So from the quick panel on the back, it's nice and easy to head up to the focusing options and change into continual autofocusing plus tracking, because that's what this feature is going to do. Now we're going to go and head into the menu and find our autofocusing options in the A3 menu under tracking subject. At the moment it's switched off, but if I go to switch it on, I get a choice of motorsports, airplanes, trains, or finally birds. That's the one I want. Press OK on this, and my tracking subject detection is now on birds. So when I look out into the lake here, any birds that are there will be white boxed by the camera, and when I half press, the focus will lock on them nice and easy. So obviously, any kind of photography is a holistic thing. Lots of things need to be right for it to work, and kit is super important. So I think the main things about why I came out here with an EM1X today would be the fact that it's lightweight, these really light lenses that are really fast. That's excellent for walking around all day and excellent for getting light into the camera. The stabilization system in this camera is fantastic, so I'm getting a good 8 stops of stabilization, and particularly because I didn't want to come out with a tripod, I'm hand holding everything, so that stabilization is so much more important. The speed that it can shoot at, to be able to pump out 18 frames per second in a silent burst, that's super key as well, because wildlife changes in a second and you want to be able to capture all that as well. Nice fast focusing system, because this uses phase and contrast detect, so that's 2 focusing systems at work to get you those really, really nice clean focus between shots kind of speed. And just rolling that all together in a package, making you comfortable with the camera. As you can see, it's such a lightweight system. If you're comfortable with your camera, then your shots will be much better and much more natural. So one of the biggest tips that I can give you, particularly about handheld telephoto wildlife shooting, is think about your breathing. A lot of people will tend to take a breath in, hold their breath, and take a shot to keep themselves steady with the camera. But ideally what you want to think about is holding on an out breath. So breathe naturally and then breathe all the way out, hold that out breath, and that'll steady you up quite nicely to take that shot. Now, it's really important to not get kind of let down by things like quiet days. You know, I've had a lovely walk around Paxton Pits here today, and it's been very quiet. You know, there's not a lot of activity with the birds, but we got a couple of shots, and that's what's important. So you've just got to keep visiting places and seeing what's happening. Remember, weather can change, what the birds do and the wildlife does, but don't be let down if you come away with very few shots. Just keep at it, keep going back, and keep practicing with your camera. Well, thank you very much for following me around Paxton Pits Nature Reserve today. We didn't get many shots, but the ones we did should be quite good. And I hope that the things that we talked about will help you in your photography as well. So maybe we'll see you again on another video in the future. Take care for now.